How's it going, guys? Welcome to this tutorial. Basically, it's just a simple soldering tutorial. In this case, I'm just soldering two wires together. I just kind of want to give you a basic idea of how to do this. Typically, when I do car audio stuff, like you see here, I'm basically soldering two harnesses together. And I like to use the soldering method rather than sort of butt splices or things like that. I just find that after time, butt splices can come unplugged, or they don't have quite a good resilience as a good soldering joint. So I just like to do it this way. You're certainly free to use butt splices on this particular example, but this is how we're going to do it. In this case, I'm going to be using 31 thousandths inch or 0.031 inch solder, and I'm going to be using a nice soldering station from Hako, the FX888D. You can use just a plain old soldering iron. You can get a cheap one. I think they're like 10-20 bucks on Amazon or at your local electronics store. And basically, the kind of solder I'm using has got flux in it. So first, what you're going to want to do as far as soldering a joint together, you want to make sure that your soldering iron is pre-tinned. So you're just going to get a little solder on the tip. So what I'm going to be doing here is just basically getting a little on the tip first. See, it's hard to melt at first, but it helps conduct. So we're going to melt a little onto the tip, just like that. Very nice. And then we're basically going to just go ahead and fill the joint with solder. So you kind of want to do this in one quick pass because the solder has flux inside it, and so you want to melt the flux and the solder simultaneously. So what I'm going to do basically here is I'm just going to lay the solder over the joint here like that, and I'm going to run the soldering iron across. So we're going to give that a shot here and see how this goes. So at first you see here, it's not really quite sucking onto the wires. It's kind of blobbing around. Now that's the reason that there's not a good flux in that soldering or in that solder. So you end up getting a ball on there. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to try to melt this off and try to get a better example there. I'm trying to give you an example of how kind of terrible it looks. And honestly, I wasn't quite prepared for the fact that the solder was going to be sort of balled up on the tip and there wasn't going to be any flux in there. But basically you need to dissolve enough flux to get a good amount of flux in the joint before you actually get the solder to absorb through the wire. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to kind of melt off some of this. Yeah, like that. Get it nice and smoothed out. And then we should actually, you know what, this is holding, weirdly enough, so I'm going to go ahead and flip this over and try to do the back side. Typically, the problem that you run into with soldering is that, if you don't get enough flux in the joint, it'll just never work, but you want to make sure it's one solid motion, right? So basically just putting the solder down on the wire and then running the soldering iron across it, sort of melting the flux, melting the metal, and also heating up the wires simultaneously, so then the flux just kind of gets into the joint. I'm going to do another one here real quick just to sort of better demonstrate because the first one just kind of worked despite the fact that it probably shouldn't have. Once you basically melted the solder and it's on the wire, the flux is essentially gone. So, that kind of worked out in my favor. I got a little lucky on that one, but normally that wouldn't be how it goes. So I'm going to strip this wire back real quick and I'll sort of demonstrate this again. I've acquired another hand for this. Yeah, it's a little bit pain in the ass if you don't have an extra hand. So I've gotten a victim from the audience, or my brother, who's running the camera. So I'm just going to go ahead and try this again. I'm going to fill it in the joint just to kind of show you how this works. Basically, get your soldering iron in there, get your solder in there, and just one fluid motion, just shove as much solder as needed to get it in the joint. And it should pretty much go in right away. Yeah, this joint doesn't look super good. You can see it's kind of only about halfway covered at this point, but that's kind of the idea there, right? So the flux gets in there and cleans out the opening, and then you can kind of, if you want to, you can be like me, get a little risky here, and you can kind of clean it up a little bit by remelting the solder a bit, and that usually gives you a nice coverage. But you can't really remelt it too many times, and you can see how I'm having sort of some difficulty getting it to work again. But it actually does okay here, and yeah, so it gets together. Just like that. Perfect. So, you know, okay, I'm not going to pretend that I'm like the best at soldering, to be honest. And of course, it took me a long time to even get this good at it, which isn't very good. But it seems to work, and honestly, like, you can't really complain. So that's pretty much it, really. There's not a whole lot else to talk about as far as basic soldering. This video is kind of short, and I hope it was kind of informative, at least. And that's about it, really. Questions, comments, concerns, comment section below, of course. If you have any more questions for me, or you want me to do some more interesting soldering videos, or what have you, let me know. Otherwise, well, stay tuned for other things that I'll be doing on the channel. Should be a good time.